Welcome to CFM Talks. I'm Lisa Harnett, and we have Natalia and Michael here with us today. And we're talking about how to use your cost allocation strategies to understand your AWS bill. And each one of these presentations is designed to be around a specific questions. So as we've worked over the last month, the questions that we were talking about today are around how can I link my spend to business units or cost centers? Are my team staying in their budget? How do I know how much each workload is going to cost us? And how do we give teams a visibility of their AWS spend, as well as what tools are right for building and maintaining that cost allocation strategy? So these are the questions that we've designed today's talk around. And when we get into the demo, you'll be able to see how those strategies actually get what they actually mean for your implementation, as well as what you can do to kind of keep those on track. So I'm going to go ahead now and pass it off to Michael to go over the agenda. Thank you so much for being here. By the way, this presentation will be available for download in this session later in the closer to the Q&A period. You can write in written questions, which will get answered as we go in the background, as well as we'll have live Q&A at the very end using those written questions back into the talk. And the recording will be available out on our website in the next week or so, as well as on YouTube. But I'll pass it back over to Michael now.
Thanks, Lisa. All right, well, welcome everybody. I'm so excited to talk to you guys today about cost allocation and how we can use that effectively to help you drive business outcomes. As Lisa mentioned, there's a number of different questions that cost allocation can help you solve for your business. So we're going to talk a little bit about what cost allocation really is and why it's so important to organizations. We're going to talk about the building blocks that you can use to design and then implement that strategy, along with the tools and techniques in AWS in particular. Natalia is going to take us through a demo of how to view the results of that cost allocation implementation in the AWS console. And then we'll have some key takeaways and areas that you can think about for ongoing maturity in your cloud financial management journey. As Lisa mentioned, there'll be some time for Q&A at the end, but also please put those in the chat as we go. So what do we mean by cost allocation? Cost allocation is a broad set of practices for assigning or distributing charges across users and teams. You think about the questions that you guys want answered. What are the top resources contributing to my spend? What does it cost to run a specific application in AWS? What is driving changes to my AWS spend? Cost allocation is how we get there. And it's typically done in a predefined or pre-agreed way with the users and teams that you're working with, so that there's transparency on what charges those teams should expect to receive and why they receive those. And in essence, this is why it's an important topic for organizations as they mature in the cloud. Cost allocation allows an organization to answer those key questions. And beyond that, though, it really allows for increased maturity through analysis of the charges. So if we think about which applications or products are costing the most to run, those are typically good applications or products to think about optimizing more heavily or to consider re-architecting. If there are specific areas of spend that are increasing faster than others, whether it's compute or storage, those are areas to look at the architecture and understand why. Also, something that's very important for the cloud in particular is who's responsible for doing that work. It may not be the same as what it has been historically in your on-premise infrastructure. All of that to say, cost allocation can help you as an organization enable intelligent cloud financial decision-making. A recent study by Hackett Group showed that organizations with higher levels of cost allocation applied nearly twice the number of optimization strategies to reduce their cloud spend. And I think most organizations recognize how important that is. So if our goal is to define or to be more intelligent in how we make financial decisions in the cloud, how do we define intelligent? And I think that's a really good question. It starts with having the right people at the table. Many of you in the audience are developers, engineers, solution or system architects. You've got some IT executives. Most of you are probably responsible for the cloud estate itself. But cloud isn't for IT. It's an organizational shared venture to drive business outcomes. And that's why we have some business professionals and business executives on the call here as well, because you are very invested in the results of your cloud work. Finance in particular is usually interested in budgeting and forecasting the spend to make sure we can project and predict where we're going to be spending our money. Accounting wants to make sure that it's accurately reflected in the books. Procurement wants to make sure that we have the right amount paid on the invoice and that it's drawing down against the right purchase order. And for you business executives, you're primarily concerned with achieving those outcomes that you're using the cloud for in the first place. And let's be honest, no one wants to be surprised with the cloud bill. So how do we start that journey? Well, first of all, it's important to remember that cloud financial management is a journey. It's not a single one-time activity. You will evolve the model iteratively with the support and feedback of your entire stakeholder team. And as you do that, you're going to look for some key characteristics in your cost allocation model. You want it to be transparent with all the parties involved. Your business teams should have access to the data that helps them understand how they're using the cloud. Ideally, it's a user interface that the team is already trained on how to use or can easily learn. It's important that you keep the model simple over time and avoid adding unnecessary complexity. Keep the easy stuff easy, right? Finally, leverage existing data sources that are either already well maintained by the business or that automatically update from another system. All of these work together to ensure that your cost allocation model will be effective and will help you drive results for your business. Let's talk through some common approaches for allocating costs. For smaller organizations or those that are earlier on in their cloud journey, you can simply apply a fixed amount of cost to teams, departments, or line of business. Or you can proportionally apply cost to those teams, departments, or lines of business. However, you're attending this talk, so chances are you are looking to do something a little more, let's say, mature than just directly splitting or proportionally splitting. The three main approaches that we see are account-based splitting, resource tagging-based splitting, and cost category-based splitting. Don't worry, we'll get into what all those are in just a little bit. Let's start with that first one, AWS accounts. AWS accounts provide a natural boundary for isolating costs. It's the core resource container in AWS. As a result, some strategies will start with using accounts as the first place to assign or allocate your costs. You'll see on the left, you could just have some standalone accounts that, as a building block, lets you pay for your resources directly. As your organization grows and matures, you'll see that there are economies of scale that you can gain by pulling accounts together into an organization. So in the middle, we've got a single payer account structure where you have multiple accounts that are all being billed in a consolidated manner. And in some cases, you may find that there's a reason to have multiple payer accounts. At the end, these are the core building blocks of your account strategy: AWS accounts and AWS organizations. As you mature as an organization, you'll want to find ways to provide deeper levels of visibility into your usage. That's where resource tagging and cost categories will come into play. So let's take a look at a couple of examples of single payer and multi-payer account structures here. The organization on the left is grouping accounts by application lifecycle or environment. You may have different environments today where you keep your development separate from test, and it's pretty common to do that from a governance perspective. It's also common to do so from a cost perspective. You want to keep your R&D costs separate from your production costs. The organization on the right is grouping cost by project rather than environment. So if we have discrete projects where we may need to be able to report on or charge back those costs very clearly, we have it structured that way. So why might you pick one structure versus another? I mentioned that AWS accounts provide a strong isolation boundary. This is true not just for billing and costs, but also for security and other dimensions. As a result, your organization structure, your OU structure, is often used to accommodate not just your billing strategy, but also your security, compliance, and governance strategies as well. It's overloaded, to use the technical term, from that perspective. So as a result, you're probably thinking about solving this not just from a financial perspective, but also from a governance. We have to go back to our stakeholders, all of them, and identify an account structure that's going to work well for you. And generally speaking, you probably have an account structure need that covers both of these cases, where you are probably going to separate both by environment and by either product or team or some other line of business level. So keeping this in mind, you're going to have multiple accounts. You're going to group them in OUs based on a variety of needs, not just billing and cost. And there's going to be some tension between how we structure for governance and how we structure for cost reporting. I'm going to turn it over to Natalia, who's going to take you through the next set of building blocks that lets you dig deeper into your accounts through resource tags and cost categories. Natalia?
Okay, thank you, Michael. I hope everyone can see and hear me well. Regular sound check. Yes, thank you for mentioning all of the core and basic building blocks, the accounts and the organizations. But now let's look at this from the cost allocation and from the billing perspective as well. So very often what happens with customers that we work with, they often start by looking at their AWS bill from their organizational view. They get their total monthly AWS bill, and then they start figuring out, okay, so, but what this number actually means, how much each project or each team is spending, how much this particular product is costing me. So depending on how large your organization is, you might be actually a small developer, and you might have just one account. Not necessarily having like a bunch of all these member linked accounts in an organization. And within that one account, what you might want to do is tagging. Since on our call, we have the majority of our audience as like a technical audience, so you're probably quite familiar with the concept of tagging, generally the concept of having this key value pair as a metadata. But we found that often for, let's say, if more like business or finance audience, this concept is not very familiar. So I'll just briefly mention what tagging is. So essentially, when you have a bunch of resources within your AWS account, what you can do, you can apply like a metadata to those accounts. So instead of, let's say, looking at the cost by individual resources or by larger blocks like accounts, you could view your cost by this specific tags, which could be like application tag, for example. On the screenshot here that I have, there's a bunch of example tags that are applied to one EC2 instance that is selected on the screenshot here. And one of those tags is application. And for example, this particular instance is then tagged with a value demo. And then you might have like 5 other instances that will be tagged with a value test, or you might have 10 other instances that will be tagged with the value production. So then these tags, they can then reflect in your billing tools. We will get to that a bit later. But essentially, tagging is not just about cost allocation or billing. It's also about a lot of other functions. So you might use tagging for automation. You could apply tags to resources to, for example, implement some scheduling in your environment where you want to turn off resources, let's say for the weekend, and turn them back on automatically during the working week, working hours. Or some sort of data classification or other purposes. But today we will be focusing in particular on cost allocation, how tags can be used for cost allocation. So with that in mind, I also wanted to cover what's the difference between tags and cost allocation tags. So let's say you have resources running on your account. Again, it could be instances, buckets, Lambda functions, any of those resources that are taggable, that you can actually tag. Then the difference between them simply being tagged and then these tags appearing in your billing tools like Cost Explorer or maybe Cost and Usage Report is that those tag keys have to be activated or enabled for cost allocation. Typically, within just a single account, you do this from the billing console. There is a menu called cost allocation tags, and you can activate your tag keys for cost allocation. But if you're in an organization, let's say you have multiple linked accounts, member accounts, and then you have one payer management account, you would have to activate those tags for cost allocation from the payer. It might take maybe a day or two for the data to later populate in the billing tools from the time you activate them. But that's sort of the difference. Cost allocation tags are the same tags that you apply to your resources. They are just they were just activated for cost allocation, cost visibility, so that you can see them in the billing tools. Some important points to mention regarding tagging in particular is that tags are case sensitive. So if you don't have any naming convention or any rules inside your team, how exactly you're going to tag the resources, and that is actually part of the tagging strategy overall. That, for example, if you have a tag key called application, that it either has to have a specific spelling or from capital letter or all small letters. So this actually matters, because if different people in your team will be doing it differently, you will later see it as if you have like 5 different tag keys where it's called application, or you might have like 10 different tags related to cost center. So that's not something that you want to end up with. So there are several techniques and tools that can help you remediate it. But on a high level, when you're building your tagging strategy, these are the things that you generally need to discuss with the relevant stakeholders and standardize some of those, let's say, mandatory or optional tags that you're going to apply, and which of those tags will be then later used for cost allocation and to improve cost visibility. Another thing that I also wanted to mention, besides tagging that you use for tagging your resources that are running in your account, there is a service called AWS Cost Categories, and I'm quite surprised to find out that a lot of customers actually are not aware or are not using it. It's quite a powerful mechanism that can allow you to be more specific or precise with going deeper into your tagging strategy and grouping your resources in a slightly different way. So here are some example use cases how you could utilize cost categories here. So we were talking about examples like, let's say you have an organization, you have multiple accounts, let's say you have 10 accounts, and you have 2 different teams. Each team owns 5 accounts. So what you would like to do, you would like to easily view what is the spend of each individual team. So you could take each of those 5 accounts and then group them into a cost category, and then call one of them as like team A and then team B. So whenever you're going to your billing tools, either to do cost allocation or just to view how much each team is spending, you will be easily able to group your cost by those categories, which will be like, let's say, team name or organizational unit or business unit or whatever you'll call it. Another good use case for cost categories could be, like as I mentioned, let's assume that you didn't have any naming convention around your tags, how exactly you're going to tag your resources, and then you end up having like 5 types of cost center tags with different spelling, with maybe different capitalization and all that. What you could do, you could create some cost categories where you would group all of those tags So cost category is essentially meta tagging that is even above the regular tags. You could group all of those kind of incorrectly created tag keys into one cost categories and just call it, cost center, for example. And then again, when you would be looking in the billing tools, you would just group your bill by cost category. And instead of having like 5 types of cost center tag, you will be able to see cost related to just cost center, as like one category. So that's just on a high level. Two, I'd say, big use cases how cost categories could just help with maybe could help sort of remediate any kind of mistakes that maybe you made either with your tagging in the past or maybe help group the accounts into specific teams and structures depending on, again, how your organization is built and which teams or business units you have. So I wanted to show how some of these tools might look in practice. So let's go to the console and spend some time there. So what usually happens when we get customers who come into us and ask these questions about cost allocation or tagging strategies? It really depends on the role well, we talked about stakeholders earlier. Michael talked about, the fact that you need to engage all these different stakeholders to make sure that everyone is on the same page. Because essentially, the business and maybe finance teams will be like dictating how exactly they want to view the cost. And then there will be, let's say, implementation teams or technical teams who will be actually going to the console, either of the payer account or linked member accounts, to implement that strategy. So it depends who is, who are you and which role is in your organization. But what we typically see if customers just start their journey around improving cost visibility or improving cost allocation strategy. Very often what happens is that customers go to the billing console. So here on the right side, on the top, there's billing dashboard. This is where they just look at their monthly bill. Even though we have such cool tools like Cost Explorer and Cost and Usage Report, and even other tools like different dashboards, a lot of customers just simply look at their bill here, and then they try to pretty much manually understand, what these numbers mean. So the bills page in the billing console is intended mostly for maybe procurement team or people who are dealing with invoices. They just get their total monthly invoice and then they process it. There is some breakdown just to have like high level overview, but does this really help your business to get like any extra insight into, let's say how much each product or each project costs you, or how much each of your teams are spending? So the first thing that customers will normally see is the breakdown of their cost per service. But again, like for example, let's say if I'm like a finance person, or maybe I'm somebody from FinOps, this doesn't really give me any valuable insights. It just says that, okay, this is how much we spend and this is how much we pay AWS. Okay, if you have maybe a well-defined account structure, you can look at the charges by account. So what you might find here, let's say you have like 50 accounts here. Each individual account will be dedicated to a specific team and specific project, and maybe there will be separate accounts for like test, development, and production. So there will be some separation like that. But again, in reality, in real life, what often happens is that this is not enough just to have the separation by account. And for that, there are some other tools that can be helpful. So I mentioned cost categories. So I'll show something. So it's on the left-hand side here in the billing console. I have cost categories. And here are some examples how they could be helpful. So for example, like as I said, if you have several teams that each of them are working on multiple different projects, you could just create a cost category called business units or teams or organizational units. And then you could assign, let's say, a number of accounts to each of those organizational units, or business units or teams. So for example, now I know my R&D team is spending quite a lot. So I could, go back to them and ask them to provide some more information into the projects that they are doing. My cloud engineering team is like the second one, spends a little less. And in a nutshell, like let's say the R&D team might have like 10 different accounts behind this kind of category. But when I look at the bill in tools like Cost Explorer, for example, I'll know that, okay, right, so these are all the charges associated with this whole business unit or this whole team. Now, there is something called uncategorized spend, and within the context of cost categories, what it means is that, for example, let's say you had some new accounts or new teams created within your organization, and you like in the last month or so, for example, and you didn't have a chance to categorize those new accounts yet. Maybe some of those new accounts actually belong to already existing team, so you would edit cost category and place them there, and then tomorrow you'll be able to see this cost being allocated to the relevant team. In tools like Cost Explorer, Cost and Usage Report, or any sort of custom dashboards that you have. And similarly, you could do a same separation by project. So in this case, let's assume that I have maybe just a few accounts, but I have like 10 different teams and they all work on only 2 projects. Let's assume I only have 2 projects, but I have multiple teams working on those projects. So what I could do with cost categories, I could create cost categories where I will group all the tags. So I'm tagging resources like EC2 instances, load balancers, S3 buckets, like whatever I'm running. And those, let's say all of those resources are tagged in a certain way. And let's say this group of resources is associated with a particular project. So I'm tagging them. And those resources could be across multiple accounts. So then I can create a cost category that will combine all of those specific tag keys into one category. So now, like, on the background behind this one cost category, I could actually have multiple different resources from multiple different accounts and multiple different teams like represented or like allocated to this particular category, which will be called like project retail, let's say. So now I know, okay, this is how much this project costs me per month. Let's see whether it's reasonable or feasible, or maybe we need to cut costs here or there. So depending on which types of business decision you're trying to take based on this information, cost categories could be quite useful. So you could, combine this little other blocks, building blocks, which could be accounts or tags, into a specified category, and then you can, analyze your cost from there. Again, all of this can be visible in Cost Explorer, and I'll go to Cost Explorer now to just show a few more examples. If some of you are not familiar with Cost Explorer, if you just have one single standalone AWS account, it's not enabled, just go ahead and enable it. It's a free service if you just use it in the console. If you have organization like a payer account and then multiple linked accounts, you have to enable Cost Explorer from the payer. And this is like a rule of thumb, like every time you're creating new organization, a new payer, it's always a good idea to enable Cost Explorer as soon as possible, because you'll be able to view your cost, for the past year or so, and then observe trends. So I'm coming to Cost Explorer now. I'll just click here. The default view, usually when I just come to Cost Explorer, the default view is always, it will show you cost by AWS services. And again, let's assume that I'm looking from the payer account view. So this is my payer. I go to Cost Explorer. I look at this cost. Again, does this really provide me the information I need? Just looking at how much I spend on each AWS service, I actually want to know the information about specific teams or applications or even environments. So I need to, maybe apply different filters. So just very briefly, for some people who are not super familiar with Cost Explorer, there are some main parameters that you need to be aware of, but it's pretty intuitive. I highly encourage you to just go and check it out. If you don't have access, check in your organization who can grant you access to Cost Explorer, and if you are able to look at the tool. because as I mentioned, it's free in the console, available for any account. So some of the parameters here is date range. So it goes back to 12, 13 months. You can actually observe trends for the last year. You can also view granularity. By default, monthly and daily granularity is enabled. So, for example, if you want to look at your costs on a daily basis for the past, few weeks or months, just to again observe some trends, you choose the relevant granularity. And then group by dimension, and then filters. These are quite powerful parameters when used together in a right way. So let's just look at some examples. So we looked at cost categories, right? There is actually a group by option by cost categories. So if you've set up your cost categories already, you either group some of the accounts or some of the tags or some of the other parameters. Then you can actually view cost by those specific cost categories, like for example, by organizational unit. So in Cost Explorer, like in my example, I can see also the trend. Let's say over time, I can look in like 1 year back if I wanted, over time, how much each of these different departments or teams are spending. Or I can view cost by project. Again, because I've already set up the cost category, I've created the relevant rules, I've combined the resources based on their tags into specific projects, and now I can see how much each project costs me. And again, it could be either project or product or application, depending what's important or what matters to your business, right? So now let's say I want to dig a little deeper. So if I look at the organizational unit, right? So let's say I want to know what the cloud engineering team is doing. So I want to apply some extra rules. You can actually go and filter this cost category. So under the filters here, let's say, let's select organizational unit, and let's select, what do we have here? Cloud engineering. And now you can group by something else. Like in my example, I could group by specific accounts or services. Like I can see, so what it tells me now that, okay, the cloud engineering team, these are the services that they are using. Right, but then let's assume that I know that the cloud engineering team is working on a couple of projects, or let's say they develop and manage like 3 or 4 different applications within their accounts. So I want to know how much they spend on each of those applications. So if they're, again, assuming that the resources are tagged, you could again group by the tag. So in my example, I know that some of my resources are tagged with the tag key application. So if I group by the application, now what I see that, okay, now I see that the cloud engineering team actually runs like 4 different applications. But then there's something called NoTag Key application. So I wanted to mention what that means. So generally with the NoTag Key application, it's either the cost associated with resources that are not taggable, you just can't tag this kind of resources. Typically it's upfront or recurring charges for reserved instances or savings plans. Some of the support fees cannot be tagged. Tax as well, like VAT in Europe, for example. So you can't really allocate that tax that those charge types using like AWS native tools. But then also some of the resources might be just not tagged at all. It could be EC2 instances that this cloud engineering team decided to forget about and not tag. Now let's assume that like, I'm in this central team and like I'm going back to my cloud engineering team and telling them you have to go and tag your resources. Why are you not tagging? And now let's say I'm the maybe manager of the cloud engineering team or one of the engineers in that team, and how can I actually find out which of my resources don't have the tag that my finance team wants me to have? So there's this tool. Now, again, like we are assuming that now I'm in the account of the cloud engineering team, right? So we go to the tag editor, and this is where you can pretty much find the resources within your account that are not tagged in a certain way. So I'll just very briefly show it here. If you go to tag editor, and let's say what I want to find all resources in all regions that don't have the tag key application. I could select all of the supported resource types, but just for the purpose of this demo, I'll just select a couple like RDS clusters, maybe S3 buckets. And now I need to find the tag key in question. So in my case, it's tag key application and the tag value not tagged. So this should hopefully find all of my RDS instances or clusters and all of my S3 buckets that are not tagged with the tag key application. And when it finds the relevant resources, let's assume, what if all of these resources are related to the same application? I could even click on all of them, go to manage tags of selected resources here, and just add that tag key application here, and call it whatever, and then apply the same tag to the whole bunch of those resources. Or maybe I could select just a group of those resources and apply this tag there. So this is a good kind of remediation step. If you found that for whatever reason, some of the resources on your account are not tagged, and they are required to be tagged, you can use tag editor to find those resources. Or it also could be that you find some resources that should have been terminated long ago. We all we are all into cost optimization right now, and whichever ways you can use to find the resources that you should not be probably running or forgot to terminate. There are all of these different tools, and tag editor could be one of them potentially. You could find a lot of resources that should have been terminated and saved long ago. So and the last thing that I'll show. Now let's assume, I'm looking at this payer account. I see that there are accounts and teams that are not tagging their resources. How to prevent it in the future? So the best thing to do, and again, this requires some governance conversations with all the relevant stakeholders, because you'd have to go to your organization's service and potentially apply policies. So this would be like a proactive enforcement. One thing I'll mention, two things I'll mention, is service control policies and tag policies. So for example, what you can do with tag policies, you can set up rules that would require your teams to tag resources in a certain way, but specifically checking the spelling, capitalization, and even, let's say, set up the rule which values can be applied to those tags. So this is just some sort of like soft governance around, the tagging of resources that your teams might be implementing. However, tag policies won't necessarily prevent your teams from creating resources without this tag, right? So let's say I have a tag policy for the tag environment, but I can still create resources without that tag. For that, you might want to use service control policies. So it is actually possible to create service control policies in a way that to deny creation of resources without a specific tag key. Like, let's say if a resource doesn't have a tag key application or cost center, you will not be able to create it. So those are some of the reactive and proactive tools that you could use to kind of complement your cost allocation strategy, both from the visibility perspective and from some governance perspective as well. So we talked about the strategy, right? So the QR code that you see on the screen, it will refer you back to the tagging white paper. So last year, we updated the tagging best practices white paper. And if you have not checked it yet, I highly recommend to take a look because it talks about all of these elements quite in depth that we discussed with Michael today, both from the kind of building blocks perspective and engaging right stakeholders and the process, and also which tools and techniques you can use to actually implement the tagging strategy. So the key here is ownership, and also that you don't have to implement it across whole organization straight away. Some customers tell me that, oh, it's complicated. We have so many different teams. Start from small and then iterate one by one. If you implement it with one team, if it works, then you can take that learning and implement it further with other teams. Again, utilizing the same tools from governance perspective and cost visibility perspective. And like as I mentioned, so a few tools that I showed on the demo, the service control policies, tag policies, utilize them to proactively enforce some of the strategies that you decide to go with in your organization. And then also there are some reactive tools that you can use for both cost visibility and some of the cost governance from the cost allocation perspective too. So some of the final thoughts, Michael?
Yeah, so thanks, Natalia. It was really great to see the AWS console. Let's take a concrete example and walk through an AWS organization. Let's assume that in my organization, I'm going to group my accounts into OUs based on the ownership of those accounts. So let's say in this case by business department. So I've got a retail OU and an engineering OU. And inside those OUs, I'm going to separate my accounts by environment. Now you can see the account name. We've got each of the names, the environment name and the business department name in there as well. That's going to be important. Now inside those accounts, we're going to use some cost allocation tags. And we're going to use that to identify the application that the team is running and the team that owns that. From there, we're going to use cost allocation tags to help automate the rest of the strategy. So the department can be extrapolated from the AWS account and the account structure and the OU, as can the environment, because we have that as part of our account structure. The cost center might be dependent on the specific team or application that we're building. And so we build a cost category rule that looks at those tags and automatically fills in the cost category for your developers. For all you developers out there that struggle to remember specific cost center codes, this is a good way to avoid getting those wrong. Finally, we've got our cost allocation tags and our cost categories. All of that can flow up into Cost Explorer, AWS budgets, and your cost and usage reports so that you can use that downstream to enable visibility for your stakeholders and to use forecasting and planning tools. I mentioned early on that cloud financial management is a journey, and cost allocation is just one important step in that journey. It's by no means the destination. So once you've established that strategy in collaboration with your business stakeholders, you've gone through a couple of these iterations, like Natalia said, you're improving based on feedback, and you have a good foundation for a cost-aware culture. Where do you go next? Well, so the first is you can create greater awareness within your organization of your cloud costs and efficiency through the use of analytics dashboards. AWS has shared a set of customizable dashboards called the Cloud Intelligence Dashboards that provide a baseline set of views of your AWS usage. You can leverage AWS budgets and cost anomaly detection to plan, forecast, and proactively manage your AWS spend, and as a mechanism to drive cost optimization across your organization. Finally, you can use your application data to more closely align your usage costs with your business metrics. So if we think about those application unit costs, I know a number of you are really interested in that, and hopefully we can do a follow-up session on something like that. Unit costs are really useful for demonstrating how your application efficiency changes over time as you re-architect, as your scale changes. There's actually a couple of references and links that we'll share. I see some have been shared in the chat already, but we have a list of those that will be in the deck that comes out that address various aspects of designing and implementing your strategy. So Natalia, if you want to show the links page there. And then we'll open it up to Q&A. I saw a number that went through the chat, and there may be some more that we want to open up.
Yeah, I saw some in the chat. We could address some of them if it makes sense.
Maybe one we should touch on. Natalia, there was one about tagging of data transfer.
Yeah, Yeah, so the data transfer is an interesting one. Like you can't exactly tag the data transfer itself, like the charge. However, for the majority of the resources that generate the traffic, which could be, EC2 instances, load balancers, NAT gateways, S3 buckets, CloudFront distributions, if those resources are tagged, then the underlying data transfer charges that those resources generate will sort of appear under the relevant tag. However, there may be a bunch of data transfer related charges that cannot be tagged. Not all of the resources can be tagged, and effectively, maybe some of the smaller services or less, let's say that were recently launched, maybe there can be some issues with tagging there just yet. But generally, yeah, that's how it would potentially work. But if you're tagging the underlying resources that are generating the traffic, yeah.
Yeah, that was a lot of the questions in the chat in the back end was around what do I do with these things I can't tag? How do I manage those? And I know that different organizations do different things when it comes to that. They allocate it based on, we know these applications by checking other logs. We know these applications contributed. We look at their overall costs and we divide by whatever. We know their S3 buckets are this big. We divide by the S3 buckets for those applications that use this. Because it's probably their data that's being moved around.
The popular
another
question
common one is, I would say another common one is the AWS support charges, right? Especially if you're on enterprise support, being able to distribute those out. And one common way is to use a cost category, then use cost category splitting. We didn't talk about that today. That's more of an advanced use case for cost categories, but that can be used to take cost and split it out proportionally based on the values of the tags.
Yeah. The common question is often about resource IDs, like viewing cost by individual resources. You could, it's generally not a best practice to, let's say, tag each of your individual resources with like resource ID, because if you want to view the cost by actual resources, you can check it in the cost and usage report, because if you create cost and usage report, it has all of this set of rich data about all of your resources on an hourly basis. And if you tick the box, include resource ID, your cost and usage report will include resource IDs, and you will be able to use that data to view kind of trends related to specific individual resource IDs. From tagging perspective, the idea is for cost allocation is that you want to group those resources into meaningful categories. So like if you tag your resources with like application name or team name, and then like let's assume you have this kind of typical 3-tier application, and then you pick all of this compute instances or database clusters and some load balancers, and maybe you have CloudFront distribution and some additional, maybe caching, sorry, can't pronounce it, caching instances, and you tag it with like the application name, then you know that, okay, right, so for example, this 3-tier application costs me this much. And then you can be like, okay, so how much revenue that application generates me? So we are kind of touching the topic on unit cost, not unit cost, but more like business metrics and KPIs, right? So tagging and cost categories allow you to get closer to this idea of linking the kind of business value to your actual AWS charges, if it makes sense.
Yeah. That makes sense. So I have one question as I drop my AirPod out. What is the fastest way to find resources that don't have tags?
So tag editor would be the best option. So tag editor works from each individual like linked account in case you have organization with multiple member accounts, right? So it could be like a task for your teams to go and check their tag editor from their accounts. However, it's like there's no really an option to search for resources that have no tags at all, but you need to set a rule, like for example, find resources that don't have an application tag, or find resources that don't have like cost center tag. So you need to specify sort of which tag you're looking for. And you could look for a combination of tags, like find resources that don't have application and cost center tag. So I'd say try out Tag Editor for that. Yeah.
Okay.
Just maybe I'll add one more to that. But if you depending on your role in the organization, obviously you could also use like a cost and usage report if you have access to it from the payer account view. If tags are enabled for cost allocation, you could actually search by those specific tags. Those tags will have their own columns in cost and usage report at the very end of the report. And you could, for example, search, oh, okay, which resources don't have like this specific tag applied or value, tag value applied. So it could be those two, depending again on the use case.
So, okay. There's a couple questions just about CUR in general. The CUR is still refreshed up to every 8 hours, depending on the size of your account, or up to 3 times a day, I think is what we say, not necessarily every 8 hours. And then the CUR is finalized around the time when your bill is finalized. So it's somewhere before the 15th of the month. But it will depend on your account size. But it's when your bill is finalized. That's when the CUR is generally finalized.
Yeah, I'd say for customers that are maybe smaller, that have less accounts, and they just get their one AWS bill, monthly bill, then the CUR should be finalized like around 4th or 5th of the following month. So let's say now we're in April, what is it, 11th of April? Most likely your CUR for March is already finalized. But then for some other customers who have maybe some extra sort of special services like enterprise support or some other types of charges that may take a few more days to finalize in the bill, then that's, as Lisa mentioned, typically before the middle of the next month, the cost and usage report should be up to date with all of these charges. Anything else?
I'm going to do one more question. Well, there's a bunch of more on that, but let's see. A lot of it goes back to the shared costs, but maybe like multiple applications, or they use a common network, even though those are the ones that are really coming in, or what do I do about those shared situations, which are all harder. And I know every customer I talk to has different standards for how they apply them, because it's all application.
Yeah, so when we talk about when we talk about shared costs and shared infrastructure, whether that's VPCs and so forth, or whether that's Kubernetes clusters, right? There's a couple of different approaches. We talked earlier about the maturity levels, right? And starting with tagging and moving towards more advanced approaches. A more advanced approach for container platforms would be through telemetry coming out of the container platform. And so I think this is a really interesting space to watch. There's definitely some things that are coming in this area that's going to make that easier. But for the purposes of most organizations, cost categories with proportional splitting or with fixed allocation splitting is the most common pattern to date.
Yeah. All right. I think that's as much as we can answer in this session today. Thank you guys so much for being here and doing the presentation. We really appreciate it. I love the demo, obviously, and it's been a pleasure working with you. I think we got a lot of questions answered for our customers here today. Next month, we'll be talking about forecasting cloud spend for new and existing workloads. And next week, actually, we're doing talking about partnership to drive CFM and our Peer Connect event. Those are every the third Wednesday of the month, just like these ones are on the second Tuesday of the month. And they're actually talking about how in the last year, Nubank has been able to do cost optimization and drive significant savings with changes to their overall program. And on Thursdays, we always have Keys to Optimization live on Twitch, where you can also ask questions. So those are the events we have coming up. Thank you so much for attending this one. Please complete the survey, give us feedback on what was good, what was bad, and what you'd like to see more of. And thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much, Natalia and Michael. It has been a pleasure working with you on this.
Thank you.
Thank you.